This is video number 1 in our evolution series. It's not too long. It's about 21 slides, including the intro slide and the closing slide. So let's jump right in and get it done. So whenever I say the word evolution, the first person who should come to mind should be Charles Darwin, who is always known as the father of evolution. He lived from 1809 to about 1882. You don't really need to memorize that or anything, but it's just kind of good to know. And he was a naturalist by trade, and he was British. He is the first person to really fine-tune and propose the idea of evolution via natural selection. He was also a scientist at heart, and he supported his theory by collecting evidence that pretty much said that this is kind of how it happened. It really showcased the theory that he came up with. Again, just to remind you, this is a video. So at any point in time, feel free to pause it and take the notes that you need and write down what you need to write down. But yeah, so I'm going to move on to the next slide now. Okay, so Darwin had the unique experience of being able to travel around the world on Her Majesty's ship, the Beagle, or HMS Beagle. And he did this when he was only 22 years old. And it's through his travels to a lot of very different and unique lands, especially when compared to England, he was able to make the observations of nature that allowed him to come up with his theory of evolution via natural selection. And this is a picture of the ship. That was the mighty HMS Beagle. That was known as, hey, this was a top-notch ship back in the day. But that's what it looks like. And here's her captain. The path that his journeys took, or his travels took, he was able to take a very extensive journey if you look at it. He started off, of course, in England and kind of went along part of the European coast, down through the northern part of Africa's coast, and then kind of made his way across South America. Notice they mapped almost the entire perimeter of South America. They kind of ignored the regions to the north, but they definitely did everything else. Where he headed to the Galapagos Islands, where of course most of his major work took place. We always associate certain species still found in the Galapagos with Darwin. And they came through and hit New Zealand and Australia, parts of the Indian Ocean, came up through the Cape of Good Hope, which is the southern tip of Africa, back to other sections of South America, and then they retraced their steps back to Europe, or in this case to England. But it's through this extensive journey that he was able to come up with a couple of theories, the most important ones being that life is descended over time from a common ancestor, all life. He also proposed that evolution happened due to natural selection. Now, at the time, there were some going theories about how life came about and how life changes, and one of the main ones were called Lamarckian theories. Lamarck was a scientist, I think he was French, who came up with a series of concepts of if you don't use a certain ability or a certain body part, you lose that body part. So the reason that some animals have certain things is because they overuse them, whereas the reason other animals don't have certain things is because they never use them and they just kind of lose that feature. What Darwin did is he kind of took some of those Lamarckian concepts and fine-tuned them and made them way more establishable from a scientific perspective. He actually had research to back up the theories that he came with. It wasn't just hearsay and thought. By Darwin's actual observations, there were 7 to 8 of these observations that he made. And again, they were all based on what he was able to see during his journey on the HMS Beagle. So the first one is that populations change over time, and that evidence is found in the fossil record. Even as early as the 1800s, we knew there were fossils out there. We understood that they were the remains of animals or organisms that had lived before. There are always more offspring produced than the preceding generation. So for the most part, the present generation produces more children than the one before. Populations, if left unchecked, grow at a geometric rate rather than an arithmetic rate. This is pretty much just letting us know that it's geometric in the sense that there's no real formula for how a population will grow, assuming it's left alone. And that's because, as you already know, because we've already done ecology, populations are very dependent on both biotic factors and abiotic factors. So if we leave it alone, we being humans, just leave populations alone, they will grow, but we can't necessarily map that using arithmetic or math. Because you have to take a whole bunch of other things into consideration. Things like the environment that they're found in, how much food is available, how many individuals are competing for that food, the general health of the population, how many of them can mate, how many of them will mate. All of those things have to be taken into consideration. The next observation is that there is variation within given species, and that the majority of this variation is inherited. So even within members of the same species, there are going to be differences, and some of those differences, or a majority of those differences, are passed on from generation to generation. So if you look at this picture in the upper right-hand corner, here is a cat, a mother cat, with her little litter of kittens, and you can see even by looking at just these 5 kittens, there's a lot of variation here. We have kittens that are obviously black, we have kittens that are brown, and there are variations on the brown. It looks like we have kittens with some spots that are like white spots over here, and then over here it looks like we have a dark kitten, but he has like brown spots. So even within brothers and sisters born to the same parents at the same point in time, there are going to be differences. The next observation says that any variation may, to some degree, affect the ability of an organism to reproduce and contribute genes to the gene pool, thus affecting evolutionary success. So let's break it down. Because of the differences, it's going to affect whether or not that organism can and will reproduce. Only organisms that reproduce put genes in the gene pool, which makes them evolutionarily successful. Remember, in biology, success is defined as I live long enough to reproduce. I've added my genes to the gene pool of my population. If you don't do that, then technically we don't consider you a successful organism from a reproductive standpoint. So you might have a difference that obviously sets you apart from other members of your species, and that could be a good thing, or that could be a bad thing. That difference could be something that attracts the females of your species to you, or that difference could be something that tells the females of your species that this is not necessarily a male that we want to mate with. We don't want those genes in our gene pool, and then they'll shun you, and your genes don't go anywhere. Alright, we're going to move on to the next set. The next observation says that species change over time, and these changes are related to traits that are inherited or arise from an alteration in the genetic code. So when we talk about changing, we can be talking about how they're physically changing, so phenotypically, but we can also be talking about how their behavior is changing. That could be because of genetics, and we could talk, and all of these are dependent on genotypic changes to DNA. You change the DNA, you're going to see an outward change, and you may see a behavioral change. So species changing over time all happens because of changes to the genetic code. Some inherited traits are beneficial, and they contribute to survival. I mean, that one's pretty simple. If I inherited traits that allow me to run faster, and I can hunt down prey more efficiently, then that means I'm eating more, it means I'm healthier, it means that I will survive long enough to hopefully reproduce. Whether a trait is beneficial or not is a function of the environment in which it lives. So when you have changes to the DNA, it's not done from I'm going to make a base change here because that's going to give me a beneficial change. Or I'm going to make a base change here because that's not going to give me a beneficial change. That's not how it works. Whether or not the trait is beneficial depends on where you live and who else lives around you and what circumstances you're fighting. Because what's a beneficial trait in one kind of environment may not be beneficial in another. Let's take the example of the polar bear. One of their genetic traits that's very beneficial to where they live is the fact that they have a lot of dense, thick white fur. That white fur helps to insulate them. It's also waterproof or watertight, so that they live kind of a semi-aquatic lifestyle. So that allows them to get into the water and get out and dry off fairly quickly without actually getting their skin and their core wet. Underneath all of that white fur, they also have black skin, and it's a combination of the black skin attracting a little bit of sun so that they do pull in heat, but all that thick white fur preventing the heat that their body naturally produces from, they don't lose as much body heat is what I'm trying to say, because of that thick fur that they produce. So in the Arctic, where a polar bear lives, both of these things are very beneficial. Those two traits give them an edge. Well, if we were to take that polar bear and move him to the Amazon jungle, not as beneficial. Now his white fur is going to cause him to stick out like a sore thumb. Everyone can see him coming from miles away, and he won't be able to effectively hunt or feed. And all of that thick fur is going to keep him very, very hot, as well as his black skin. He is now in an environment that is not as cold as the one he was in before. He doesn't really need to trap heat. Now, more than ever, he needs to be able to efficiently lose heat. So you take our polar bear friend and put him in the Amazon, and those things that were once beneficial are now detrimental. Of Darwin's evolution theory is natural selection. So what does that mean? Well, natural selection is, first of all, is variation that exists in population, differences between members of the same species. It means that there is an overproduction of offspring. We have way more offspring born than the environment can technically support. Part of it is competition. There's going to be competition between individuals and even members of other species for food, mates, nesting sites, to escape predators, all of those things. It's differential survival, which just means that it allows for adaptation. Certain traits which cause us to be successful get passed on, whereas traits that cause us not to be successful dwindle. There's also differential reproduction, where adaptations become more common in the population, and eventually we make another change. So changes are constantly happening. But all of these things encompass natural selection. Natural selection is happening because of all of these parts and pieces. Adaptation anyway. Well, we use the terms adaptation and fitness a lot in biology, and it's important that you understand what the difference is or what they mean. But adaptation is a genetically controlled trait that is preferred, if you will, by natural selection. It gives the organism that possesses that trait a reproductive advantage, and that means that the trait is going to be passed on to the offspring of that successful organism. Now, the trait may allow the individual to survive longer because they're eating more, they're running faster, they're hiding better, they have poison, whatever. But more than anything, if they survive longer, it means that their chances of reproducing increase. Evolutionary success just refers to, do you contribute genes to the gene pool? That's it. Did you get to reproduce? It has nothing to do with how long an animal is going to live. Let's go back over. When we're talking about adaptations are genetic traits that allow or give an organism an advantage. Sometimes that trait allows the organism to live longer. By living longer, it increases their chances of reproducing. That's what an adaptation is. Whereas fitness or evolutionary success means that you have reproduced. You have placed your genes in the gene pool, but it has nothing to do with how long you, the organism, lives. How the environment is going to affect adaptations and eventually the evolutionary success or fitness of an organism. Well, you know that the Earth's environment is constantly changing, and especially now that humans play such a big and commanding role in our world, the Earth's environment is changing a whole lot faster than it used to. So because of this, traits or adaptations that at one point in time were favorable may become unfavorable. The same thing that gave you an edge 10 years ago may no longer give you an edge now. They might actually cause you to die faster. So let's look at the example of the peppered moth, and I'm pretty sure you've done this one before. You probably did it your freshman year. The peppered moth exists in England, in parts of Europe, period, and originally the moths looked like this top picture. They were mostly white with a few black speckles because they live on birch trees, and birch trees have a lot of white and black coloration on them. Now, before the Industrial Revolution, this is what the moth population looks like. About 98% of the population looks like this one, like the moth on top, whereas only about 2% looked like the moth on the bottom, fully dark, because they do come in both varieties. After the Industrial Revolution, because of the large amount of soot and sulfur dioxide that burning coal produces, it changed the environment, specifically the trees that these moths exist on. So let's fast forward 50 years after the Industrial Revolution, and now we have a flip-flop. Now 95% of the moths are dark, and only about 5% of them are speckled. And it's because the trees went from being speckled to being mostly dark. So let's look at this picture here with the tree, how it used to be. If you look at it, here's a black moth, easily spotted. But if I had not circled this area right here for you, you probably would not have seen the speckled moth that sits right where my laser's pointing. Right there, there's a moth. But without me circling that, you wouldn't have been able to see, because they blended in with their background so perfectly that it was very hard to see them. Well, they're moths, which means that birds eat them, so it's good for them to blend in with their background. That way they're not like dying left, right, and center. But because of the Industrial Revolution, this tree literally changed colors. It's no longer speckled. Now it's completely black. Well, how is that going to help our moth population? Let's move to the next slide, and we'll talk about all of the things that happen. We'll make the best of it. So, after the Industrial Revolution, all of these white and speckled trees are now wholly and solely black. So it creates a situation where our speckled moths, or our white and black moths, are now obvious. So they can be seen on these new trees. Well, if the speckled moths can be seen, it means that the dark ones can't. So if you're a bird looking for a moth meal, which one are you going to be able to see? If you look at the picture here, this guy is way more obvious than this guy is, which means that this guy is going to be the one that's eaten. So because of this change to their environment, it means that the speckled moths are eaten more frequently. If they're eaten more frequently, that means they're probably not reproducing. Okay? So if the speckled moths aren't reproducing, it means that the genes that allow them to be speckled or black and white are dwindling. slide here. I ran out of room, so hold on 1 second. Okay, so we know that the white moths can be seen. We know that they are eaten more frequently. We know that the genes that they possess are becoming smaller and smaller. Like in the gene pool, there are less and less of those genes. Now you know that science works in opposites. So if that's happening to the white moths, then the opposite is happening to the dark moths. The dark moths are not eaten as frequently. Which means that they're living longer, probably. Which means that they're reproducing more. I spelled reproducing wrong, sorry. Which means that their genes are increasing in the gene pool. So, over 50 years, it's quite easy to see how we would go from having a population that is mostly white with just a few black moths to having a population that's mostly black with just a few white moths. It's all because of who's living long enough to reproduce, which genes are increasing in the gene pool, and which genes are decreasing in the gene pool. Okay, so hope this makes sense. Talked about natural selection. We've talked about Darwin's observations. We know that his theory on evolution is very much linked to natural selection. He thinks evolution happens by natural selection. But we haven't talked about what evolution is. So evolution is defined as a change in the inherited characteristics of biological populations over successive generations. Now, I adjusted my voice when I said population. It's written differently here for a reason. Evolution does not affect individuals. It affects the entire population or species that that individual belongs to. So the way that I like to think of it is an individual adapts, but a population evolves. Okay? Individuals do not evolve. Now, the evolutionary process, because of the very nature of it, it means that we become diverse at every level of biological organization, from a cell all the way down to an individual, all the way up, to an individual, and including, entire species, entire populations. Because of this diversity, well, let's think of why we're this diverse, first of all. Diversity isn't just a complete individual thing. We come from somewhere. We have instructions, if you will, that make us who we are. The reason we are diverse, and when I say we, I mean us, the individual organisms, and us, the species of organisms, the reason we're diverse is because our genetic code is diverse. Our DNA and the other molecules that are important for life, they're diverse as well. So diversity is everywhere, right down from a molecular level all the way up to an entire population. I ever talk about evolution. In more recent years, we've actually taken the term evolution and turned it into what we call an umbrella term. We can break it down even further. There are actually two kinds of evolution. One which is called microevolution, and the other is called macroevolution. So starting off with micro, as you know, micro means small. So when we talk about microevolution, we're talking about a change in gene frequency within a population. when we say gene frequency, how often do we see a particular gene? And when I say gene, I literally mean, big B, little b, or big B, little b. Okay? So genes can change, or gene frequency changes all the time. It can be done quickly over a short period of time, like we see one generational change to another generational change, or sometimes it happens and it takes a longer period of time. Now, why do these changes come about? Well, sometimes natural selection just favors that particular gene. That gene gives an advantage of some sort, and it makes that organism more adaptable and more successful. Sometimes the population got immigrants that came in carrying that gene. That's called gene flow. So I moved to this country, I brought my genes with me. If I reproduce and have offspring in this country, then I've now entered the gene pool of America. I brought my genes with me. My genes flowed with me or traveled with me. Another way that changes might occur is because non-resistant genes mutate into a resistant version of the gene. So like when we talk about resistant bacteria, for example, or we talk about resistant pests, they may have a gene for resistance that's not activated. If that gene becomes activated, they're no longer susceptible to whatever medicines or pesticides or whatever it is you're giving them. And then the last way is through just what we call random genetic drift from one generation to the next. Sometimes these things are completely random, and there really isn't a good explanation for why you're seeing a change in frequency. Okay. So what about macroevolution? Well, macroevolution is evolution on a scale of separated gene pools, not individuals. We're talking about species as a whole. So think of it as an accumulation of changes which results in what we call speciation, or the forming of a new species. Enough things have changed whereby you are, at least to me, you are completely different from I am. I no longer recognize you as someone that I can mate with, so when that happens, we form a new species. It focuses on change that occurs at or above the level of species, okay? So we'll have a whole video on speciation. We'll talk very in depth about what speciation is and how it occurs later on in our evolution section. Through natural selection. But what about humans? Do we affect the gene pool any? Yeah, we do. And our version of selection is called artificial selection. And we do it with a bunch of different things. Think of your puppy at home, your dog. Dogs are a good example of how we have artificially selected to create a certain species. So I'm going to blow your mind a little bit. You're vegan, or vegetarian, or you just really like vegetables. You're about to take a walk on the wild side. A lot of the foods, the vegetables that we eat, that you probably think grow somewhere, they actually don't. One of the best examples of how humans select for certain traits within a particular species is through the development of vegetables like cauliflower. Oops, that's my laser. Okay, cauliflower, broccoli, kale, Brussels sprouts. If you're familiar with any of those or you eat any of those, I hate to be the one to break this to you, but broccoli and cauliflower don't grow in like a broccoli forest or anything. They are selected for by humans. All of these vegetables come from one plant. It's called the mustard plant. This is a picture of it here. And we have selected for certain desirable traits so that we can, from that one plant, we can grow a multitude of different vegetables. The cauliflower would be like the flower of the mustard plant, whereas broccoli, that would be the buds that happen along the. Sorry, I'm drawing a blank here. But yeah, the buds that happen along the length of the plant. Kale would be the leaves of the mustard plant. The root system gives rise to, never say this, kohlrabi. So fruit, vegetable that we eat. So yeah, that's where that comes from. And then other sprouts give rise to Brussels sprouts. So a bunch of different vegetables all come from the same plant. Interesting. So let's look at that picture again. This is what the mustard plant looks like in real life. These are some examples of the vegetables that come from it. But it's not just this one process. We do it all over the place in all kinds of ways. Okay, so what is artificial selection? It is the manipulation of a gene pool by humans. And are there consequences to these activities? Yes, there is. Artificial selection decreases genetic diversity. And a good example of this is antibiotic resistance of bacteria. So it's because of some of you that we have to take super drugs when we have bacterial infections now. Because a lot of people, during the course of not completing their antibiotic dosage, they've allowed these bacteria to be exposed to the medicine and to develop defenses against that medicine, thereby making them resistant. Antibiotics and artificial selection work together to create havoc. So when antibiotics are given to a population of microorganisms, which is normally done to treat some kind of infection, some of these microorganisms may already be immune to that drug. And that happens randomly. A random mutation happens in their genetic code, and one of the benefits is that they just naturally have this resistance to this particular drug. These resistant organisms, because the drugs don't kill them, they just continue to grow, and they continue to reproduce, and they keep passing on that genetic trait that gives them resistance, and that causes a whole population of them to be produced, all of which are antibiotic resistant. So what does it mean for our doctor? It means that he's going to have to find an alternative way to treat this infection. And the way they normally do that is they just give us a different type of antibiotic in the hope that none of the bacteria or the microbes are immune to that one as well. Well, sometimes some of them possess another kind of random mutation that makes them resistant to the second antibiotic as well. And it just keeps going over and over again. We literally have strains of bacteria that none of the antibiotics that we have really work on them anymore. Okay. I just like this cartoon, so I thought I'd share it. These are two microbes, so you can read it. It makes me laugh. It'll make you laugh too. I love how he's giving him a piece of DNA. That's cool. Alright, we're going to move on. So I said that artificial selection decreases genetic diversity, or just diversity, period. It is true. A lot of our activities as humans just kind of interfere with the gene pool. A lot of our activities prevent natural genetic drift and gene flow from taking place. We interrupt migratory paths. We prevent organisms from resettling into new places because we've put up fences or we've cultivated the land to use it for something else. And all of the fact that our animals can no longer move around as they please, the way they used to be able to at one point in time, is going to reduce the genetic variation in various populations because we're not getting new genes in and out. This is going to disrupt the ability of those organisms to adapt both locally and globally. So a good example of this is looking at this little guy, which is called a collared lizard, and they live in Missouri. The area that they live in is a region where forest fires used to naturally occur. But because of humans, we've suppressed that. Because, forest fires kind of interrupt with the plans that we have for the area. We don't want to rebuild houses. We don't constantly want to be packing up shop and running away because the fire is chasing us. So we've suppressed those forest fires. Well, the suppression of forest fires in that area has reduced the habitat and it's disrupted the gene flow of this particular lizard. And because of that, the balance has changed. So we're not allowing the lizards to move genes in and out, and there's not enough variation being created anymore because the lizards can't move around and can't utilize their environment the best way that they should. And you're probably wondering, well, what's the time of the forest fire? That's how they moved. They only moved when a fire took over the area and they were kind of like forced to move away. But it promoted gene flow in their population because the fire is no longer triggering their movement. They don't move. They just stay where they are. Now, we can manage this. We can balance it out, but we have to be willing to do so. Unfortunately, the vast majority of humans don't really care about what's going on with an animal population as long as we are happy and healthy and comfortable. Alright, so hopefully this wasn't too painful, and most of it made sense, but of course, if you have any questions, let me know. Hopefully you guys are studying super hard for your test on Tuesday. So, talk to you soon. Have a great weekend. Bye.